I'd like to start by acknowledging that this meeting takes place on the unceded ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam peoples. This is the third annual Chinmoy Banerjee Lecture on Anti-Racism. Chinmoy Banerjee was a colleague of ours at SFU and a brave fighter against racism throughout his life. After his death, this lecture was set up as a joint collaboration between the Institute of Humanity for the Humanities, I should get it right, Institute for the Humanities, which is putting on the conference which is surrounding this year, and the Hari Sharma Foundation. So I would like to introduce Harinder Mahil, who is representative of the Hari Sharma Foundation.
Thank you. I'll come up here. From my trade union days, I can only speak up when I stand up. It's difficult to be speaking out. Thanks, Ian. Thank you to all of you who braved this weather to come here. As Ian talked about, this is the third annual Professor Chin Banerjee Memorial Lecture. It gives me a great pleasure to talk to you about my friend and comrade, Professor Chin Banerjee, and the reason for us to come together to name this lecture Dr. Chin Banerjee Memorial Lecture on Anti-Racism. As Ian talked about, Chin Banerjee taught English literature, literary criticism, and post-colonial studies at Simon Fraser for 35 years. For many of those years, he was both voted and celebrated by students as the best teacher. Chin completed his undergrad and his master's degrees in English literature at Delhi University in 1966. Then he moved to the US to do his PhD at Kent State University. During his time at Kent State, Chin began his lifelong involvement with progressive politics, starting with protests against Vietnam War. On May 4th, 1970, while Chin was trying to bring his 4-year-old son, Anand, to campus preschool, he was turned away by the nervous National Guardsmen who pointed guns at his car. Just a few minutes later, 4 young students had been shot dead. And Chin's perspective and political allegiance had crystallized. From there on, there were no compromises for him. In 1970, the family moved to Canada, and Chin started to teach at Simon Fraser. His political activism began in earnest when he co-founded an advocacy collective, Indian People Association North America, also known as IPANA, in 1975. IPANA was an organization of progressive Indo-Canadians living in North America who opposed imperialism and supported democratic rights and social justice in India. Chin and I became friends when we met for the first time in December 1975. We remained both personal and political friends until the day he died on June 29th, 2020. I saw him as my teacher, as my mentor, to whom I looked up to for guidance and advice. Chin was always busy with multiple projects. From his day-to-day activities, it was hard to tell that he had a full-time job as a professor at the university. He was organizing meetings and rallies in support of various people's struggles around the world. Having engaged in various anti-racist struggles in the 70s, Chin was one of the founding members and leaders of an organization called BC Organization to Fight Racism, also known as BCOFR, and which was established in 1980. It became one of the prominent anti-racist organizations in the province. Among its significant achievement was to mobilize the public, various groups from various different sectors, to stand against and oppose Ku Klux Klan, which was attempting to establish a new base in Vancouver in the early 1980s. He was also one of the founding members and leaders of non-resident Indians for Secularism and Democracy, which eventually became South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, known as SUNSAD. Among his philanthropic acts, Chin was the first president of Dr. Hari Sharma Foundation for South Asian Advancement, which was established in 2010. The foundation, in addition to sponsoring cultural events for local international organizations, coordinated international conferences and cultural events on migrant labor, racism, and the environment. The foundation also funded multiple research projects and scholarship. A few weeks before he died, Chin came together with a number of progressive individuals to establish West Coast Coalition Against Racism, an organization dedicated to fighting racism and Islamophobia. The organization has established a small display, and if you are interested in learning more about it, please leave your name and email address and we'll keep in touch with you. Chin leaves behind a legacy of activism in the service of humankind. He inspired hundreds of us to fight for human rights and for a better world without suffering or oppression, with equality, regardless of religion, caste, race, or gender. Soon after his death, Professor Samir Gandesa, who is with the Institute for the Humanities, put forward a proposal in honor of Chin's intellectual and political contribution that a lecture be set up in Chin's name, and it be sponsored by the Institute along with his partners. Of course, his proposal was accepted not only by the Institute, but also by Dr. Hari Sharma Foundation, the West Coast Coalition Against Racism, South Asian Network for Secularism and Democracy, and Independent Jewish Voices. The first lecture was delivered by Toronto-based writer Robin Maynard in 2022. Robin, you must know, is noted for a 2017 book, Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to Present, which received a number of awards and nominations. The second lecture was delivered last year by Shama Sawant, who served on the Seattle City Council from 2014 to 2024. She is a member of Socialist Alternative, the first and only member of the party to date to be elected to public office in the US. Now, I'm going to be calling on independent Palestinian artists to introduce this year's speaker. I did say to Sobi that my hats off, my salute to him, to any Palestinian who would get up and is able to talk some sense, because what's going on in his homeland. Sobi Al-Zubaydi was born in Jerusalem and grew up in the El Zalazon refugee camp in the West Bank. I may not be pronouncing the name of the refugee camp correctly. His father comes from village Safria, now transferred into a Jewish town, and his mother from the village of Kweli, which was erased like many other villages in 1949. He studied economic and philosophy at Virgin University and film production and cinema at New York University. He has produced and directed numerous documentary films focusing on Palestinian struggle under colonization, and has published several essays and journalistic pieces on Palestinian art and culture. It's my pleasure to call upon Sobi Al-Zubaydi to introduce this year's speaker. Sobi.
Thank you. Thank you all. I will not take long. I know. I can't wait to hear Gord speaking. It is my pleasure to introduce Gord. I never met him before, but I feel like I know him. I know him like a distant relative. Someone I know, relates to me, but I never met him. But deep down, I know that this person exists, and the bond that ties us, the relation that connects us, is there also. And this is due to the fact that we both come from a shared history, which is the history of settler colonialism. Gord and myself, we both grew up seeing our lands, our landscape, our mountains, our seas, our rivers taken away from us. Seeing our men, women put in jail, being deported. We have so much to learn from each other, to share with each other. I remember when I first came to Simon Fraser University, I always deleted it from my biography, but I came to do my PhD at Simon Fraser University. My work is on space and memory. I'm an all but dissertation, ABD, but I'll be presenting my dissertation soon after so many years of work. When I first came in 2006 to study here at SFU, I remember the first lecture I sat and I heard the land acknowledgement. And I was shocked. Not only conceptually, but really emotionally and mentally. I was shocked. I was like, just wow. Why does this happen here and does not happen in Palestine? Few months after we arrived, it was Stephen Harper, the Prime Minister then, and the Canadian government decided to issue an apology for the residential school in 2006. And then, wow, then I started to think for myself as a Palestinian, just to compare myself, to compare our situation to the situation here in Canada, where after 75 years, we, in the eyes of the Israelis, not only they do not recognize, we do not exist. We do not exist as a nation. We do not exist as a language. We do not exist as a nation. They refer to us as Arabs. Arabs only to displace us linguistically, as if we came from the surrounding Arab countries to live in this piece of land in Palestine, but we're not from there. 75 years, we never heard an Israeli official stand and recognize the Palestinian or issue an apology or anything. This is the difference. Back then I realized this is the difference between two situations. A settler colonial state that issues apologies, that sort of initiates a truth and reconciliation, that issues apologies for the residential school, that does quite a few things. And there is another settler colonial model where based on complete total, absolute denial of the other. It is correct that we should look for the shared experience, but also at the same time, we should not lose track of the differences between the two models. I will be talking about this on Sunday. I know I don't have much time now to talk about it. It's Gord's presentation, but there is so much to talk about it. Not only do we need to discuss, and it's time, it's really, there is an urgency about discussing the relationship not only between Palestinian activists and Palestinian struggle and indigenous struggle, because we do share this history, but also we need to discuss not only solidarity, we need to talk about something, although we share the same agonies, the same pain, the same loss of land, the same. Yet, there are differences, there are nuances. For example, indigenous people remained fighting on their land. They were not evacuated from their country. They were internally displaced, taken from the good land, but in not so good land. But overall, indigenous people remained in connection with their rivers and seas and mountains, with their salmon, with their trees, with their cedars. Albeit on a much lesser level, but still they remained in contact. Whereas Palestinians, if you come to the Palestinian community, we are made of refugees, asylum seekers, evacuees, just people who lost connection, people who have been completely pushed out of the country, people who have been completely pushed out of the land. Being on the land or not being on the land is a crucial thing in how we conceive of our resistance, how we practice our resistance, how do we practice our solidarity. This, again, I will talk more about it on Sunday, hopefully. But for now, I want to introduce a brilliant indigenous artist who, if there is a way to describe, Gord is one of the artists who took the responsibility of rewriting history with his own hand. Rewriting the history of indigenous people that's been written by the settler colonial state. We, Palestinians, indigenous activists, intellectuals, scholars, the first thing we face is the rewriting of history. And how do we rewrite the history? How do we challenge the official historicization of our culture and our history with our memory? We refer to our memory. We refer to our memory. We posit our memory against the history. And, you know, it will take so long time if I if I delve into memory and history. I will leave you with Gord, and I hope that after his presentation, we can have a discussion. And I just want to bring to your attention one thing, that in the last year, since October last year, I'm not going to talk about all the killings and the sadness and the fascism and the dark times. It gets darker every day, but deep inside of us, I am as a Palestinian, and I appreciate your comment. I know we live in dark times, but this is nothing new. This genocide is only an intensification of the genocide that already started in 1948. When the Israelis occupied Palestine, the motto, the first thing they came with, the slogan they came with, a land with no people for people with no land. Now, when I come, a land with no people, that already erased the people. The slogan got rid of the people. So it just like, somebody tells you don't exist, your language don't exist, this land is not yours. That's genocide. That's somebody's is really like completely, massively severing your relationship with the geography and the history and the culture of this country. So our situation, this is why when we Palestinians are not really completely shocked and like speechless after all what's happening, because we've been going through it for 75, 76 years now, albeit different intensifications, different periods. My life story, if I tell you my life story, I can, for Israeli fascism, I don't need to read a book. I don't need to write a book or an essay about Israeli fascism. I can tell you my biography, how I grew up, where I grew up, and where did I play, the places I had access to play, and what happened to them. And this is the story of my life, a story of loss of geography, landscape, and places that constitute my sense of identity. These were constantly, we live in a vanishing landscape, land that completely, constantly, continually vanishes. What does this do to us? A lot, but this is not the place to talk about it again. I'm gonna leave you with Gord, and I look forward to just a brilliant discussion afterwards. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I was concerned. I'd lost my USB thing. Yo, my name is Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation. And our territory is on northern Vancouver Island, and that's where I've come from. I drove down here. It's a pretty long commute. It's like 11 hours because of the driving and the ferries. Thankfully, I'm going to miss the atmospheric river. It should be gone by Sunday when I return. So I'm going to talk about colonization and apartheid. And I have a kind of a more of an emphasis on Israeli apartheid because I think it's something that's really important to understand. And I think it's kind of it's one of the weak points. One of the concerns of Israel is that they're labeled an apartheid state because they look at the experience of South Africa and the movement that arose to defeat apartheid. So anyway, that's what I'm going to kind of focus on. I think it's something that's it's a little hard to grasp sometimes, the nuances and the technicalities of the apartheid regime in Israel, because you have the occupied territories and then you have the state of Israel itself. Yeah, so I got like 30 minutes, so I'm just going to kind of breeze through this. So I found this graphic this morning. When I was looking through my Facebook stuff, a friend of mine had sent me this. So this is a poster I did in 1989. It was during the Intifada, the first Intifada. And that was around the time I was kind of becoming politicized. So the Intifada had a big impact, a big inspiring impact on me to see the Palestinian resistance in the face of this like very advanced military power. So this was a poster I distributed. So for a few years ago, many years ago, actually, I was working with the Native Youth Movement, and we were kind of like a generation that descended from the Red Power generation from the 60s and the 70s, the Red Power movement, American Indian movement. And so a lot of the youth that I was working with kind of came through that history. But in our organizing work, I found it sometimes it was kind of a challenge trying to talk about these concepts like colonialism, because there wasn't really any easy definition. It's not a part of our everyday vocabulary to talk about colonialism. So, because when I tried to look up a definition of colonialism, it would talk about the period of European exploration in the 15th century, the 16th century, and whatnot. So I found it very lacking. And so I devised some definitions myself. So one definition I came up with was colonialism is the invasion and occupation of other people's territories for settlement and or resource exploitation. And I have the difference in there because every colonial project kind of has differences based on the population density of the indigenous people, the terrain, the geography, and the cultures that are involved. So, for example, if we look at the British and the French in North America, they had different objectives. So the French were mostly interested in the fur trade. So there were a few thousand French settlers came over to North America, and they were kind of there to administer the colony, but really to engage in the fur trade and to make sure that this resource exploitation was being carried out. But if we look at the British were really interested in transferring large amounts of settlers to the new colonies in North America. So there's tens of thousands of British settlers that came over in the 15th and 16th century. And that was one of the reasons why a lot of indigenous nations allied themselves with the French, because they weren't on this campaign to acquire more and more land as the British were. And ironically, it was the majority of indigenous nations allied themselves with the French, but it's kind of ironic because the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy, actually allied themselves for the most part with the British, and they kind of enabled a lot of British colonization efforts. And then now today, the Haudenosaunee are kind of at the forefront of indigenous resistance. But such is the march of history. So in trying to educate Indigenous youth about colonialism, I devised the 4 stages of colonialism. So the first stage is a reconnaissance, like a scouting mission. Christopher Columbus is a good example because when he came over in 1492, he had the 3 ships, the Pinta, the Nina, and the Santa Maria. And they're basically, the story is he's searching for a new trade routes to Asia. And they didn't even really know that the Americas existed. And of course, he landed in the Caribbean region. And after about a year, he returned to Spain. And that launched the second phase of colonialism, which is the invasion. We can look at Captain Cook here on the West Coast, Captain Vancouver as well. They both performed these kind of reconnaissance missions, so they really mapped and chartered the area. They collected artifacts, including weapons, so they could go back to the colonial powers in Europe, and they could report, this is what the population is like, this is their military capability, this is the type of resources that are in this land. So that enables them to begin the invasion stage because now they know what kind of people they're dealing with. So when Columbus returned on the second voyage, he had 18 ships and like 1,200 conquistadors or something. So that begins the invasion, which is the beginning of course, a violent military conflict. And another basic definition I had of colonization is it's a war for territory. During the invasion kind of transitions into an occupation. Once the colonial power is able to establish like a beachhead or some kind of garrison, it can begin to expand and impose an occupational type of government. So that's what the Spanish did in the Caribbean and throughout Central America. And this occupation phase can last for hundreds of years, obviously. The Romans occupied parts of Western Europe for hundreds of years and Latinized, what we know as France, Spain, and parts of Britain. And so the last phase that I had, I would often just end it with the assimilation because that's our reality in Canada. Because with these colonial projects, they have, like I mentioned, they have different objectives, which I'll get into a little bit with some different examples. But in North America, we pretty much experienced, it was obviously genocidal warfare, but it's kind of like, especially if you look in the United States, there was basically like an extermination campaign to eradicate indigenous peoples in order to take the land, because there was no looking at the indigenous peoples as a source of labor to be exploited. They were simply a population that inhabitants that had to be cleared to open up the lands for settlement. But because these indigenous peoples survived these genocidal wars, we're in this kind of period of assimilation now where they're trying to assimilate us into the nation states of the United States and Canada. So those are the 4 basic stages of colonialism. So there was different rationalizations for colonization, and one of the main ones was the doctrine of discovery, which is kind of like a political, religious foundation for justifying European colonization. And it was based on a number of declarations made by the Pope. It was like basically saying these are you have to go to the lands of non-Christians, and it's your duty and actually your moral obligation to take these lands, to Christianize these people, and to claim these lands for the Christian empire, basically. So the doctrine of discovery was a major rationalization for colonization. Another one was terra nullius, which is a Latin expression. It means nobody's land. So this is actually something that's used in court cases today. It seems really prevalent in Australia, where they declared a lot of Australia to be terra nullius. Joseph Trutch, who was the first lieutenant governor of British Columbia, also invoked this notion of terra nullius for the rationalization of why there was no need to make treaties in British Columbia, because it was terra nullius, which was nobody's land. And terra nullius, it doesn't mean that the land was empty, but it means that the inhabitants weren't cultivating the land according to how the Europeans saw resources should be exploited. And there's no sovereign state power that declares its sovereignty over this area. And of course, as my comrade mentioned, this was also one of the Zionist slogans, a land without a people for a people without a land. And that's something that's kind of taught a lot in different Zionist organizations to justify the colonization of Palestine. And it's part of their rationalization of how they try to claim that they aren't colonizers. But I do have some quotes from these early Zionists. So this one is from Zev Jabotinsky, who is a leading Zionist theoretician. And he said, Zionist colonization, even the most restricted, must either be terminated or carried out in defiance of the will of the native population. Why? Simply put, history shows that every indigenous people will resist alien settlers. And this one is from Moshe Sharet, who was an Israeli prime minister from 1953 to 1955. And he says, we have forgotten that we have not come to an empty land to inherit it, but we have come to conquer a country from people inhabiting it. So they're pretty clear about what their project is and what they're doing. And there was actually a lot of Jewish colonization committees that were established in the 1920s and 1930s with the goal of colonizing Palestine. So they were very clear about that they're colonizers and this is going to be a colonial project. But nowadays they deny it. They say, no, we're not colonizers at all. We're actually the indigenous people of Palestine. So here's a graphic of the native land dispossession. On top of is Palestine, and on the bottom is the United States of America, showing the U.S., the westward expansion of the United States. So I'll talk a bit about apartheid. So apartheid was declared a crime against humanity in 1973 by the United Nations, and it defines apartheid as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons and systematically oppressing them. And surprisingly, there were 4 nation states that were opposed to this resolution. Of course, one of them was South Africa. Another one was Portugal, who had colonies in Africa, who was engaging in a genocidal counterinsurgency war at the time, and also the United States and the United Kingdom. So the Rome Statute of 1998, as part of the International Criminal Court, has pretty much a similar definition of apartheid: inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over any other racial group or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. So the apartheid, of course, the word apartheid comes from South Africa. It's an Afrikaans word, and it means apartness. Actually, literally, it's like aparthood, but we would maybe translate it as separation. And that's how we kind of came to know the word apartheid. It was actually the slogan of the National Party in, I think, the 1948 elections in South Africa, because they came in with their platform was based on apartheid. And they said, we're gonna institutionalize the racial segregation in South Africa to protect the white minority. But I would say that apartheid is actually an integral part of colonization. because the colonial power wants to separate the indigenous people from the land, because the main objective of colonization is to take the land. It's either forced settlement and or resource exploitation. So I think a good example is the Spanish colonization of South and Central America. They had a very large kind of apartheid regime. They in fact had two separate laws. One was, they called it the Republic of Spain, and the other was the Republic of the Indians. So these are two separate bodies of laws and two separate bureaucratic institutions to institute these laws. And the Spanish also came up with a really complex racial categorization of all the different peoples that were in their colonies. So you had the people who were born in Spain, the Spaniards who were born in the colonies, the Spaniards who intermarried with indigenous peoples, their offspring had a racial category. Spaniards who intermarried with black slaves that they brought in, they had a special racial category. And then the offspring of these peoples who intermarried, so they had different racial categorization for all these different mixes of people. So a very complex bureaucracy was constructed to police this type of racial segregation. Some of the different ways the Spaniards did it, one of the foundations of the Spanish colonization was the encomienda system, which was like a slave labor system in which a village became the property of a conquistador or a Spanish settler. They were forced to pay tribute and to perform manual labor. So they had to work in these like massive plantations and ranches that the Spanish established. And they also did, this was early in the 1500s, they established this system. They also, a part of this was called the reductions, where they forcibly relocated indigenous villages so that they'd be near Spanish towns so that they could better implement the encomienda system and police the indigenous population. So all these laws and all these systems, the encomienda and the reductions, this is all like a racially segregated system for maintaining the power of the Spanish in the colony. So that's why I'm saying this apartheid is something that's integral to colonization. So as I mentioned, apartheid in South Africa became institutionalized, I think it was the 1948 elections when the National Party came to power. And they're kind of like the archetype of apartheid. Makes sense, since it's their word. So some of the main laws they had, so they had grand apartheid and petty apartheid. So some of the big apartheid laws that they passed was the Population Registration Act of 1950, which set up 4 racial categories. So there was whites, coloreds, Indians, and blacks. And then you were issued a new identity card that had your racial category on it. The other big apartheid law was the Group Areas Act of 1950, which designated land for these different racial categories. And you couldn't go onto this land if you weren't belonging to that racial category. So they had a whole bunch of other laws that they refer to as petty apartheid, which was the ban on interracial marriages, interracial sexual activities, and the segregation of public areas such as beaches and schools and hospitals. And then, of course, they had the Pass Law, which was designed to, obviously, to control the movement of people, but also to stop indigenous Africans from being in towns or cities for longer than 72 hours unless they had a special pass. So the apartheid regime in South Africa was defeated or was dismantled in the 1990s after several decades of very strong resistance among Indigenous Africans and a really strong international solidarity movement that initiated a boycott of apartheid South Africa, sanctions against South Africa. Of course, the United States supported South Africa basically until the bitter end, along with Israel, was one of the main suppliers of military arms and training to the South African Defense Force. So now I'll just talk briefly about Canada. So Canada, of course, is we refer to it as a settler colonial state. The main apartheid system that was established is through the 1876 Indian Act, which was an amalgamation of a whole bunch of previous acts. And of course, Canada had just been established as a nation state with the, with the British North America Act. So a few years later, they passed the Indian Act of 1876, which, it covered every aspect of Indigenous people's lives, but the main ones were defining who was a native, so that was the status, and who qualified for that status. The reservation system was imposed through the Indian Act, although parts of the reservation system was established through the numbered treaties that Canada made through the as it expanded westward across the provinces, and the band council system, which is our local form of governance on the reservation. And it also impacted a lot of other stuff like marriages and funerals. All this daily stuff was kind of governed through the Indian Act. And they established these Indian agents who were in charge of implementing these policies on the reserves. So the Indian Act was also amended over the years to ban, like in 1884, the potlatch and the Sundance and other ceremonies was banned. 1894, the residential school system was imposed through the Indian Act. Because of land claims organizing here in British Columbia, the Indian Act was amended to ban land claims organizing in 1927. So, of course, today we still have the Indian Act. We still have band councils and we still have the reservation system. But one thing about the Indian Act was that it was meant to be a temporary legislation until it was found that the Indigenous people were sufficiently civilized, and then the Indian Act would basically be withdrawn. And in 1970, the Liberal Party, which was the governing, which was in government, in power in Canada under the Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, they passed a white paper policy which discussed abolishing the Indian Act and getting rid of the reserves and all this. And so Indigenous people were like, no, you can't do that. And it might seem like a kind of a contradiction, but the thing with the Indian Act is like it creates a separate category, a legal category for Native people, but also for the reserve lands. So the reserve lands have a special status. And the fear was that if the Indian Act is done away with, the reserve lands are going to be opened up to be bought and sold like any other property in Canada. So there was a lot of resistance. So this white paper was withdrawn. But today we have a lot of different, there's different policies that the government is trying to carry through to actually to achieve the same goal, and that is to remove the Indian Act. So we have a lot of self-government agreements that bands are involved with, and if they sign on to these agreements, they're removed from the Indian Act, and their band members lose their status. And also, the same policy thing is incorporated into the modern day treaties, including the treaties that they're trying to negotiate here in British Columbia through the BC Treaty Commission, has kind of like the same goal. So the Nisga'a are the first ones that signed a treaty, and they are no longer under the Indian Act, and their reserve lands have been changed, and their members no longer have Indian status. So that's like, just kind of like I said, it's like a contradiction, but the reserve land is like the last remaining land base that Indigenous peoples kind of have some control over. So that's kind of why there's this opposition to abolishing the Indian Act. Because a lot of politicians come out nowadays and they present it as being something progressive, like we're going to get rid of the Indian Act and we're going to free the Native people from the chains of this apartheid kind of policies that was once the mainstay of colonization for Canada. But that's why a lot of Indigenous people are opposed to some of these self-government agreements and the modern day treaty process. So one of the things that was done through the Indian Act was the pass laws. So you had to go to the Indian agent to get permission to leave the reserve. And that was in effect from 1885 to 1941. And there was a delegation that came over from South Africa to study this pass law system, and which they later implemented in South Africa. So you can see a lot of kind of connections and solidarity almost between these colonial regimes. Okay, now I'll talk a bit about apartheid in Israel, because I think it's something that we hear about, but we don't really know some of the most basic details of. So Palestinians have been saying for quite a few decades that Israel is an apartheid regime. And I'll just run through some of the basic aspects of this. So here's, again, that same map showing the dispossession of Palestinian land. On the far right is the situation today. The green represents what's called the occupied territories, which was territories that were seized by Israel in the 1967 war. And in these territories, they have basically military rule over the Palestinians. But the rest of the state of Israel, it's not the same. And that's one of the ways Israel says, no, we're not an apartheid regime. So within Israel itself, there's about 2.1 million people, or 21% of the population, the majority of which live below the poverty line. And up until 1966, 85% of this population were actually subject to military rule as well. So the military were enforcing curfews, had a pass system to control the movements of Palestinians, and carried out repression of any political movements. And the law was also used to confiscate Palestinian land. So some of the big laws that Israel have in maintaining their apartheid regime. So the law of return, passed in 1950, declares all Jews to be citizens of the state of Israel. So any Jew can go to Israel and say, I want to be a citizen, and they'll be granted citizenship. Or if someone converts to Judaism, there's a little bit more of a process, but they can go to Israel and become a citizen. Because, of course, Israel wants to have as many settlers there as possible to strengthen its colony. And as a garrison against the Palestinians. So some more recent laws include the 2003 Citizenship and Entry into Israel law, which makes inhabitants of the West Bank and Gaza ineligible for the automatic granting of Israeli citizenship and residency permits that are usually available through marriage to an Israeli citizen. And when this act was being passed, Benjamin Netanyahu, who was then the finance minister, stated, instead of making it easier for Palestinians who want to get citizenship, we should make the process much more difficult in order to guarantee Israel's security and a Jewish majority in Israel. So this is one of the problems Israel faces, because they have 2 million Palestinians who inhabit the borders of the state of Israel. And then there's another 2 million in the West Bank, another 2 million in Gaza. And so you almost have an equal population. You have 9 million Israeli settlers approximately and 9 million Palestinians. So this idea, Israel often says we're the only democracy in the Middle East, but the last thing they want is a democracy in Israel, because that would obviously threaten the Jewish supremacy, which is what Israel is all about, right? They want to establish a Jewish supremacist state. Now, one of the ways that inside Israel they carry out this apartheid regime, so they can't just pass laws that say, okay, Palestinian can't do this, Israel can do this, because Israel is a signatory to the UN Declaration on Human Rights, and they're aware of the passing of laws that are obviously based on racial segregation isn't something that will really last. It's not something they can base themselves on, because they're going to face all this criticism. So what they did was they took a number of Jewish organizations and kind of integrated them into the state bureaucracy. So one of them was the Jewish National Fund, which was created in the early 1900s, and its purpose was to buy land in Palestine for Zionist settlement. And so the Jewish National Fund, it continues to exist to this day, and it's one of the biggest landholders in Israel. And in their constitution, this land cannot be leased or sold to non-Jews. And so this is one way that they use this non-governmental institution to maintain this apartheid regime. So one of the things the Jewish National Fund does as well is it facilitates the illegal Israeli settlements and other forms of dispossession of Palestinian land, including reforestation projects and the building of parks, including Canada Park, which the Canadian government was involved with, which has seen this destruction of numerous Palestinian villages. So one of the rare victories of the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian Solidarity movement was this year in August, the Canadian Revenue Agency removed the charitable status of the Jewish National Fund Canada because it was helping build infrastructure on Israeli military bases. So helping a foreign military isn't seen as charitable work in Canada. Another group is the Jewish Agency for Israel, which was originally a group that served to promote Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel, and it became responsible for immigration and rural settlement. And so one of the things that happens in Israel is you have these, when you want to move into a community, there's these selection committees, and they decide who can live in the neighborhood. And so this is how, another way that they're able to maintain this racial segregation, but it's not institutionalized in law. It's just a practice that's carried out. Judaization programs, when they felt that there's too many Arabs in an area, they just confiscate the land. They come up with all kinds of different reasons that the land needs to be confiscated, and then they expand or build illegal Israeli settlements. There's dozens of unrecognized villages after the State of Israel was established through massacres and forced expulsion of Palestinians. There's dozens of villages that they just didn't recognize. So these villages don't have access to any utilities or any state funding, and many have been demolished. So that is in the State of Israel, and that's just a little brief introduction, because there's a whole myriad of laws that they use to control the population, to impose this racial segregation. Within the occupied territories, They maintain a military rule over the population. So as I mentioned, the West Bank and Gaza Strip were seized during the 1967 war. Israel continues to militarily occupy these regions. And one of the aspects of this is what they call administrative detentions, where Palestinians can, well, their military rule is subject to the Palestinians, but within these areas, Israeli settlers are subject to Israeli civil law, so of course have much greater freedoms. And one of the things the Palestinians are subject to is administrative detentions, where they can just be arrested without charge and held for up to 6 months, and then whenever 6 months comes up, they can just extend that. And so there's thousands of Palestinians that are being held prisoner, and they've never been charged, let alone convicted of anything. And of course, this was one of the motivations for the Operation Al-Aqsa flood in October 7th of last year, was to take Israeli prisoners to exchange for the Palestinian prisoners. They implemented a very complex permit system which functions as a pass system. So in order for Palestinians to do anything in these occupied territories, they have to go to the Israeli military to ask for permission to travel, to work, to go to school in an area. They have to apply through these permits. I have a graphic here showing in the West Bank, because in the Gaza Strip, the Israeli military, they were trying to do the same thing what they're doing in the West Bank. In the Gaza Strip, they had illegal settlements inside Gaza, and they had a huge military force inside Gaza to protect these settlements. But the resistance was so strong in Gaza that they basically just withdrew, I think, in sometime in the early 2000s, 2005 or 2006 or something, and they wanted to hand over authority to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. But of course, Hamas won the elections, and when Hamas won the elections and defeated the Palestinian Authority, Israel just sealed off the Gaza Strip. So this whole permit and pass system is active in the West Bank because Gaza was basically made an open-air prison camp. Geographic separation. So in the West Bank, you have some 750,000 settlers. A big chunk of them are actually from the United States and Europe. They basically come to Europe, they say, I want to be a citizen, and they send them into the West Bank, and they use them to construct these illegal settlements. And a lot of these settlements are strategically located to overlook Palestinian villages and towns in the West Bank. So because of the resistance from the Palestinians, they've constructed walls in both Gaza and the West Bank. So the West Bank one is called the Separation Wall. It's known as the Apartheid Wall. They began construction in the early 2000s. Sections of it are concrete walls up to 9 meters high, and other sections are just layers and layers of barbed wire fencing. At the present time, I think it's about 440 kilometers in length. By the time they complete it, it's estimated that it'll be over 700 kilometers. And so what this does is it breaks up the Palestinian communities, and it prevents their movement between these communities, restricts access to education and work, hospitals. There's massive delay time now when someone needs an ambulance in one part of the West Bank because of these separation walls and the checkpoints. And the construction of the wall led to the confiscation of a lot of Palestinian land and the demolition of Palestinian homes and businesses that were said to be in the way of the wall. And these walls also have these zones that can be 100 meters or more that the Israelis want cleared. So any homes that are in that zone are demolished so that they have a clear line of sight between the wall and the nearest Palestinian villages or towns. So around the Gaza Strip, they've been constructing walls around Gaza since the early 1970s. But what they did beginning in the mid-90s was they began construction of what they call the Iron Wall, which is which has become a very sophisticated wall, which also has concrete sections and also the barbed wire, the layers of barbed wire. And it has, because of the tunneling that the resistance was doing, they added these barriers to stop tunneling that go down into the earth. So at the present time, it's 65 kilometers in length. It has maritime sensors on the coast and underground sensors to detect any tunnel building. It's got these sensors, these watchtowers with these remote control machine guns. And so this iron wall, it costs over $1 billion to build, and the Israeli military really relied on it as a means of containing the resistance in Gaza. And one of the things about the Israeli military is they're very high tech and they're very reliant on technology. And they think this is the answer to everything. So I will just do some high tech stuff about this. So of course, this is a wall that was, that the resistance broke through during the Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. And this, like I mentioned, this wall was used to completely seal off Gaza and transform it into an open-air prison camp. And that was another motivation for the Al-Aqsa Flood operation, was to break the siege of Gaza. It's just another look at the wall, and just describing how in 2007, that's when they implemented the siege of Gaza. So another interesting aspect, and this is more to the West Bank again, because Israel completely withdrew from Gaza, is the segregated road system. So they built roads. You can see here there's a dividing wall. On one side is a Palestinian road, and on the other side is a road exclusively for Israeli settlers. So that if you're a Palestinian and you have a car, you're given a Palestinian license plate. And there's a graphic of it as well. The Palestinian roads are filled with military checkpoints that you have to pass through as well. And this is a close-up to show the license plates. The orange one is for the Israelis and the white one is for the Palestinians. And so with all of this, Israel will deny that they're an apartheid regime. But I would say there's a lot of evidence that it is an apartheid regime, and a lot of international groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have labeled Israel an apartheid regime. So this is just a headline showing that this is one of the fears of Israel, is that they will be labeled an apartheid regime and face the same type of solidarity movement that existed, that led to the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa. So that was kind of why I wanted to kind of focus a little bit on the apartheid regime in Israel, because I think it's, like I mentioned, I think it's something that we're not really well versed in. And of course, I'm just kind of touching on the most basic parts of it, because I only have half an hour, which I'm kind of past, I think. So I just want to return to the concept of you have different objectives with the colonial projects, right? So the Spanish were really interested in the resource exploitation, the establishment of these massive plantations and ranches that were huge, were much more bigger than they could do in Spain. And of course, the gold and the silver mining was a big part of Spanish colonization. And so they had, they basically wanted to exploit the indigenous labor. But through the genocidal wars, the resistance, the disease epidemics, 90% of the indigenous population was lost. So they began importing slaves from Africa. In South Africa, you had a unique situation somewhat because you had a small white minority that wanted to control and exploit this very large black majority, a black indigenous African majority population. So they were this huge source of exploitable labor. And so the South African regime was interested in maintaining this labor force, just like the capitalists are everywhere. They want to maintain a functioning labor force, because if they don't, they're not going to have the labor power, right, which is the energy of the capitalist system. So South Africa wanted to maintain their labor force. So, they funded schools and they funded healthcare and this, basic infrastructure, the most minimal that you could have and still have a functioning labor force, a labor force that reproduces itself and that has some level of health so that it can go out and carry out this this labor. And so that was the goal of the South African colonialism and their apartheid regime. In North America, we had kind of like an extermination campaign launched by the United States primarily because they saw they didn't see a need for a labor force because they were the product of British colonialism and British settlerism and settler colonialism. And one thing, when you look at the state of Israel, it has no real interest in maintaining Palestinians as a labor force, although it does do that. It has that relationship with the Palestinians as an exploitable labor force. But you can see that their ultimate goal is the expulsion of Palestinians from their land in order to build this Israel that is a Jewish-only state. And so they have no interest in maintaining a Palestinian population as an exploitable labor force. And that's why we see now today this genocidal war being waged against the Palestinians with total impunity, because they have the backing, the unconditional support of the United States of America, for whom Israel is of such geostrategic importance in the Middle East that they will maintain the supply of weapons and the international protection that the U.S. provides for them, and along with the United States, the United Kingdom. And so they're the same powers that, supported South Africa right till the bitter end. And so one thing I just want to close with is first a drink, because I'm getting really parched from talking. So I just wanted to close with this this thing, because recently Israel is on this Israel feels like they're in the ascendancy right now because they're claiming all these victories in these genocidal wars they're waging in Palestine and now Lebanon by assassinating the leaders. And this is a policy that Israel has been carrying out for many decades. Decapitation strikes, assassinations. One thing about that is, if you look at the history, I mean, that's how Nasrallah became the head of Hezbollah, was because they had assassinated the previous leader of Hezbollah. And just this idea that if they simply assassinate the leadership, the organization is going to fall apart. Of course, history doesn't show that at all, because the resistance continues on. It's much deeper than an individual leader. And it's actually generational. So generation after generation are involved in this resistance movement. And just seeing the the assassination of the Hamas leader a couple days ago. I mean, he was such a badass. And seeing that, the quality of the leadership of the resistance, it just, I don't think the Palestinians will ever be defeated. And the only thing that maintains Israel is the United States of America. And it's the greatest enemy to humanity. And once the United States, the United States isn't going to last forever. And once it goes down, Israel is going to go down with it. And it's just a matter of when is this going to happen? And right now, looking at the conflicts that are going on in the world, there's so many factors that come into play that lead to the downfall of empires. And it's usually a convergence of these factors. So if you look at the USSR, what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union was a convergence of factors, right? Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan was one of the reasons. The Chernobyl nuclear disaster, the environmental disasters that the Soviet Union experienced as a result of its rapid industrialization, its inability to expand its economic system, the political corruption, the disillusionment among a lot of the population with the bureaucracy. All these factors led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And now when I look around the world today, you can see there's a lot of things in motion right now, like with the conflicts, a potential conflict with Iran, which would have a major impact on the global economy, the climate crisis, which is having a major impact on the capitalist system and is only going to increase as the years go on. So I asked myself, how much longer can the United States, how much longer can its empire sustain itself? And I hope not very much longer. And for the sake of the earth, I hope that this system can't maintain itself for very much longer either. And for me, that is one of the greatest hopes, is that we are facing so many crises right now. I think a lot of people get kind of freaked out by looking around the world oh my God, what's going to happen? But to me, that's the only hope, is these crises and this conflict that is now emerging and is going to expand and is going to penetrate into Fortress North America. And you can see so much of the population is thinking this way as well. And unfortunately, the far right, which this conference is kind of about, the far right, because of their conspiratorial minds, they really see this thing coming, right? and then the religious fanatics with their Armageddon apocalyptic fantasies. So they're really preparing for this type of scenario. And my main concern is that on the left and the progressive people are not as prepared and are not thinking about this reality that we're living in. So I would leave you with those words and thoughts, and free Palestine.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I really liked your final words there, and it left me with a lot to think about. I want to go back to something that we kind of discussed, our Palestinian speaker here, and the relationship between Canada, Truth and Reconciliation, and Palestine. And I was just thinking, Canada's kind of continued complicity in the genocide of Palestinians and its kind of inability to do anything material to end that genocide. Does that undermine kind of the commitment to truth and reconciliation for Indigenous Canadians, in that you can never reach, this true, you can never fully realize truth and reconciliation while, funding a genocide in a settler colonial state in Israel?
I think that would be correct to say. But I would also say that truth and reconciliation is kind of like a big public relations stunt by Canada to portray itself as so much more progressive than it is, and to showcase itself in the international community as, we're a country that have overcome our colonial history, and now Indigenous people are completely, free and equal citizens in this country, which is not the reality. And Stephen Harper, he's the one who came out and said, well, unlike others, Canada has no history of colonialism. So, of course, they're trying to minimize the impact of colonization. Just like if you look at Canadian history or the history of British Columbia, how they minimize the impact of colonialism and the violence that it was carried out with. So yeah, I think the reconciliation thing is just a big PR stunt. The same with the apology for the residential schools, and it's a way of them overcoming that, to say that's a part of our history, and we've overcome it and we've moved forward now. And it's something they can do now, because the residential schools were closed. I think the last ones were closed in the early 1990s or so. So of course now the government can come out and say, hey, that wasn't very nice what we've done, and we're sorry for that. And so here's some money, and you can just stop talking about it now, because that's history. So I think that's part of what that's about. The same with the way they present the self-government agreements and the modern day treaty process is like we're trying to correct the past wrongs. But of course, it's all part of this assimilation program that they have to assimilate Indigenous peoples legally and politically now. So yeah, another question?
Thank you for your presentation. I actually, relating back to the beginning of your presentation, I kind of have been thinking about this question a lot, but it's more so to do with the role of immigrants or immigration when it comes to settler colonialism, and then their relationship with Indigenous peoples and the whole land back movement.
Right. Yeah, the thing with North America now is we really are this multinational nation states, right? United States and Canada. So my thing is I kind of promote this multinational resistance that tries to incorporate all the different peoples. That's why the anti-capitalist resistance, that's a part of that for me, because they have an anti-colonial resistance. So it's understanding the history of colonization and how this colonialism manifests itself and things like that. So, yeah, because we can't go back in history. We can't force out all the settlers. Nobody talks about that, right? It's not like South Africa. Maybe you had the potential, or Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, where a lot of the whites left when the Black liberation movement was finally successful in overthrowing the Rhodesian regime. I mean, we're in such a different situation here. So, like people's movements, that's what we need.
You talked about a lot of similarities between the European colonization of the Americas and the situation in Israel-Palestine. I wonder if you see any differences at all between those two situations?
And if I may add South Africa as well. Like a three colonial, settler colonial model.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if there are any differences.
It's a very good question. It's a very important
Yeah,
question.
well, I wonder if Gord could answer that.
I am not answering, I'm just adding to your question.
Yeah, I think there's big differences. I mean, every colonial project is unique, and they're all very different in many different ways. There's similarities. I mean, the way in which the colonization of Palestine occurred with the support of the British and then later on the Americans, I think that was somewhat unique. I mean, the British basically wanted an Ulster in the Middle East, and that's what Israel was for them. Because Ulster was, of course, the Protestant settlers that they sent into Northern Ireland as part of their colonial project in Northern Ireland. And that's what they wanted to achieve in Palestine after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. And then, of course, the geography is very different. And the situation in Palestine today with the West Bank and Gaza Strip, it's very, very unique from other colonial situations. I mean, you have the racial segregation of these communities, like the Bantustans in South Africa or the reservation system here, but very, very different. I mean, the population...
More about the differences.
The population of Gaza basically has almost the entire population of Indigenous people in Canada is encompassed inside Gaza, which is a very, very small strip of land. So you have the concentration of forces of the Indigenous population in that one region, whereas in Canada, Indigenous people are dispersed all across the country. The concentration of forces means you have a much stronger military capacity, and that's what we've seen out of Gaza. There's a very strong military capacity. And Canada, you don't really see that, right? Except in some instances like Oka in 1990, where we had a 77-day armed standoff because the Mohawks, and that was why I was saying it's kind of ironic that the Haudenosaunee helped the British so much, because now they're at the forefront of resistance in Canada, right? But the Mohawks have a very unique situation where they are able to actually engage in armed resistance. But otherwise, Indigenous people being so spread out across the country and in these very rural areas, well, now they have access to the highways and the railway lines and stuff like that. And so that's been the most effective, at times, tactic that Indigenous people have used, is blockading the highways and stuff like that. I mean, so that's a really big, significant difference to me. It's just the population density in Gaza and the West Bank compared to Canada. Of course, with these stages of colonialism I was talking about, Canada, we've had colonial powers here for 500 years now, right? And that colonization has been carried out for 500 years. And in Palestine, it's like 75 years now. So that's a big, huge difference. The warfare that you're seeing in Palestine, that was the norm here in North America in the 1600s and the 1700s. Like, if you look at the Ohio Valley in the 1700s, these types of raids and attacks, like what we saw with El Aqsa flood, that was common, right? Like the raids on settlements, the taking of prisoners, all of this stuff. And it's common in almost every colonial situation. One thing, just on a little side note, a lot of those prisoners that were taken by the Indigenous people, primarily women and children, because the men were just killed, right? So the women and children are brought back to the village, And in the Eastern Woodlands, they had a practice of adopting prisoners into the community, into the family, to replace people that they'd lost in war. And during some of these military campaigns, the colonial powers, if they defeated an indigenous group, they would demand the return of all those prisoners, all those settlers. And most of them didn't want to go back. Most of the prisoners, the settlers, they didn't want to go back to be in the French towns or the British towns. On a side note. Another question from someone.
Sego Gord. I'm a Mohawk from Six Nations territory in Yawagoa. I just found your talk today so refreshing. And I guess I don't so much have a question, but I'm hoping for a comment from you on the label of terrorist or terrorism. We just saw Sami Doon, the Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, be designated as a terrorist entity in Canada. And the Canadian state has also called our people, Ngwahonwe, the Haudenosaunee, 1492 Lamback Lane, domestic terrorists. I've heard politicians refer to the Wet'suwet'en land defenders as domestic terrorists, even though they're defending their lands and waters on their unceded, unsurrendered territory. And just a side note too, like not from out here, but I mean, in so-called BC, I mean, this is very much an occupation of unceded Indigenous lands, right? That's why you're never going to see David Eby. You're never going to see Sonia Furstenau. You're never going to see John Rustad, talk about, Palestinian resistance as being a legal right. It's a legal right under international law that all occupied people have to resist. And yet, I see, my worry is if that we don't start normalizing, and this goes for, all you folks here who are allies here on these lands, normalizing resistance and defending resistance, we're going to see increasingly the state turning around and, referring to our people who are defending our lands here as terrorists. And that's a very scary proposition. And I just wondered if you had anything to say about that.
The terrorist designation is something that these colonial powers use anytime there's resistance. All resistance to them is labeled as terrorism. The thing is, like Nelson Mandela, who, was a part of the anti-apartheid movement, was elected in the mid-90s or so. The president of South Africa remained on the United States terrorist designation list until 2008. What a farce. So, yeah, the terrorist designation is just something they label anything that they find problematic or oppositional or actual resistance to their policies and their regimes. And it's the same as the label of savages that they had for Indigenous people, or hostiles. So I don't really pay any mind to it, except that it does have legal ramifications here in Canada, because now if your group is designated as a terrorist entity, you can't do fundraising for them, you can't promote them. I mean, they tried arresting people in Toronto for carrying the flags of the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and trying to say that they were promoting a terrorist entity. But they withdrew those charges, I believe. So yeah, I mean, it is a slippery slope, isn't it? In regards to British Columbia, yeah, there is no, there's virtually the entire province is unceded. So Canada stopped making treaties when they got to British Columbia, and part of it was because of Trutch declaring a terra nullius. And they probably figured our job is done. We've colonized the continent, and we're just not going to bother with treaties now. And they just imposed the regime over Indigenous peoples. But yeah, terrorism.
Gord, how do you see the future of Canada? From your, what you wish for, the scenario that would appeal to you For example, I grew up in Palestine. All my life, I grew up, I grew up in a refugee camp. It's like growing up in a reserve here. And all the discourse around me, like from adulthood, from when I was a kid until adulthood, is that the only way for us to gain our freedom is to get rid of the Jews. Just get them out. We have to fight until they leave. But this, like with life, this little by little, however, changed. So there is an alternative sort of proposition that to fight for a secular democratic state where all people, settlers and native, live sort of a democratic, equal citizenship, rights, etc.
Yeah.
I'm like, ideally, again, as a Palestinian, the deep-seated dream inside of me, if I am like a superhero and I can do things, I will probably do this, like get Palestine back to the Palestinians. But because I'm not a superhero, I'm not God, I cannot do this, then I started to think maybe the only way is to democratize this fascist monster called Israel. And the only way to democratize this fascist monster is to fight for a secular democratic state that is not Jewish, that is inclusive for all the people living on the land.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to hear your.
I mean, as an outsider, I would say that looks like the best solution. I mean, Jews and Palestinians lived together; they coexisted for centuries before the Zionists came. So I don't see why. It's already been shown that can happen, right? Yeah. As for Canada, I mean, Canada's like. I mean, I'm an anti-capitalist, so I would like to see this whole system dismantled and areas be autonomous, self-organized, without a centralized state power. So that's my vision of a Canada, right? But the capitalist system is like a global system. We've got the United States. The United States has to go down. It has to go down for life on Earth to continue. I mean, it's like, yeah, I just hate the United States so much. Yeah, so anyway, yes.
Yeah, thanks so much for the talk. So yeah, I'm Jewish. I'm Ashkenazi Jewish, so that's Eastern European heritage. And I think just to bring it back to like some of the origins of tonight's talk, I want to talk about racism and the construct of European racism as a particular historic phenomena that kind of, undergirds all three scenarios that you brought up in your presentation, and what a useful tool it's been in all three scenarios. And I think I just wanted to speak to the experience of the Ashkenazi Jews who suffered through the pogroms and then, of course, the Nazi Holocaust, and how the Nazi Holocaust drove so many Jews to Israel as this sort of false solution, this shamara of what actual solidarity might look like, or actual anti-racism or anti-Nazism or anti-fascism might look like. And now we're dealing with the results of that having been a total lie. And I guess I just wonder, from your perspective, how racism intersects with this, how the ideology of racism that's still so alive and well and perhaps even growing greater and greater, how it intersects. Because I know, the anti-Arab sentiment, the anti-Muslim sentiment, and the anti-Palestinian sentiment that has grown really for a long time, but especially heightened after the so-called war on terror, is something that's being tapped into right now in order to justify this terror, I'll say terrorism, but in order to justify this genocide that's happening. And I just wonder how readily this type of racist discourse can be accessible or reached for in these various scenarios. Yeah, sorry to be going on long.
Kind of lost that last part there, but yeah. The funny thing about the white race is like it didn't really exist until Europe started getting into conflict with all these colonial things they were doing. There wasn't really a concept of a white race and this concept of what is white changed over time. So Italians weren't considered white. Polish weren't considered white. Italians weren't considered white. So there's it's just this changing thing, and now the racist right has this thing that they're the ones under siege and facing possible extinction. So that's a big motivator for the white racists, is they think they're out to save the white race now. And yeah, we have been exposed to decades of Islamophobia, beginning like strongly in the 1970s, I would say. They had all these Hollywood movies come in. You had the conflicts in the Middle East that they're labeling terrorism. U.S. troops going into Lebanon in the early 80s. And just this decades of Islamophobia and then decades of pro-Israeli propaganda that we've been subjected to. And this paralyzes the population right now in terms of confronting the genocide that's going on and mobilizing people. And I think that's why it's really the younger generation that's really come out against this genocide that Israel is carrying out. And that's why they wanted to ban TikTok, because it's this major communication app that's being used by young people, and it's filled with like pro-Palestinian solidarity content. But this other stuff, like right now, I'm updating the Antifa Comic Book because my editors wanted to include this surge in Islamophobia we've seen in the last few years, which is seen, it's a part of the rise of the far right. The far right that we've seen expand in Europe, a lot of it is coming from Islamophobia. The civil war in Syria, like in Germany, for example, Germany brought in hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees, and that's part of this backlash that's coming in Germany is this Islamophobia. The alternative for Germany, the AfD, the far right party, that's how it started, as an Islamophobic group. And then we have these mosque massacres that have occurred. It's just insane. But that's the trajectory of the far right now, is Islamophobia. And definitely, like you mentioned, the global war on terror, the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, and the consequences of that, which included Islamic State, which was produced from the US invasion of Iraq. And that inflames more Islamophobia in this weird loop. But yeah, the white race is, that's why they love Trump too. He's seen as the last hope of the white race in America to maintain power and to reimpose, a white racist, a white supremacist state that they see has been like completely obliterated by all these woke people. So white racism is a big issue. It's a huge factor with the expansion of the far right and these, the genocide that's going on in Palestine. It's pretty crazy. Another crazy thing I found was the Christian Zionists. There are millions of them in the United States of America, and their thing is the Jews have to be in control of Israel in order for the rapture to occur. And then when Jesus comes back, he's going to destroy the Jews. It's just such bizarre religious fanaticism. And it's strong though. Like there's a very strong movement in the US that supports this.
I must stand up. I cannot go home to sleep with a sentence in the background. I hate the Americans.
America.
I hate America, yeah? I know these sentences because I don't know how old you are. I was such a stupid woman sometimes, yes? and now as a granny against the far right-wing parties in Berlin, every time when they shout, "Ganz Berlin hasst die AfD," I say, stop, no hate messages. Ganz Berlin against the AfD, but not the hate message.
I think it's time to close now. We're supposed to be out by 9, and we're just about there. It's nice that we all have lots more to say about the subject. There is lots more to say, but at this meeting, maybe we should bring it to a close and thank Gord Hill for a very exciting lecture.
Thank you for coming up.